And so we come to the last in our series about the pandemic, not just what it did to the community, but primarily what it did to the food bank, the London Food Bank, what it enabled the food bank to do that it wasn't able to do before. It's because the London public and the business community and others donated so much that we were able to take on some of these projects. So this series has covered a lot of things like the depot system that we set up around the city, the South Street investment in affordable housing that we're doing, helping to provide food for that project. There's the greenhouse project that we're involved in. There's all the different kind of donations that have been coming in now that are more online than they have been in the past, and that enables us to do a number of things as well. But the reality is that we're still up against it. We all know this. We feel even in London that things aren't right. We've never really bounced back from what was there before. And just to put that in a bit of context, this is the way it's always been. Actually, if we think about it, prior to World War II, during the 20s and the 30s, the average Canadian salary was $630 per year. That's what it was. And of course, then the Depression came along and it was tough. And then the war came along and suddenly Canada got on a mobilized kind of footing, not just overseas, but here as well, as we start to manufacture and do the other things that were necessary. Men and women were essential to those things. And the United States really revolutionized what they were doing and got things going. So all of a sudden, we now had economies that weren't just about profit making, they were about fighting for things that we really believed in. And then after World War II, those men and women who followed that war, my dad was one of those. He was a war veteran and he was badly wounded. And in my early years, I got to see that. I was born in 1950 and I saw him struggle. But he and so many others like him and their wives and their sisters and their daughters and their mothers all got together and really began to press that they wanted a different kind of world than what they had had before. It seemed like a world of have and have nots, but it also seemed like a very risky world. Like all of a sudden, people were all going to war. Europe was just doing what it always did. It always seemed to be fighting, and Canada had been drawn into it. So Canada came up with a number of solutions. Some of them were international. They worked with international bodies. We know about Lester Pearson winning the Nobel Peace Prize for what he did about peacekeeping there in the Middle East. But Canada was part of the UN, fundamental to it as it first got started in San Francisco, and has been fundamental to it ever since. So Canada was looking at it and trying to find ways in which it could make the world more stable. That was really important because whatever happens at home, if you keep going to war all the time, it's really difficult. But at home, and that was interesting, they all got together and decided, you know what? We need universities, we need more high schools, we need community centers, we need national parks, we need hospitals, we need emergency rooms, we need trained doctors, we need scientists, we need research centers, we need to be able to travel. And governments responded to that. And they didn't just do it out of the goodness of their heart. Canadians had all come back at the end of World War II and were ready to be mobilized and keep it going, keep rolling the dice and keep making this thing happen so that a middle class could be born and begin to determine its own future. And that's exactly what happened. And it was amazing. I mean, the St. Lawrence Seaway, the expansion of the railway system, airports built all across the country, universities, kids being able to go to post-secondary institutions. There was immigration, there was fighting for peace overseas, all of those things. Like it was an amazing generation. But it was just that. It was a generation. By the time the late 70s and the 80s came along, the wealth that had been in Canada was able to kind of be moved overseas and invested in other things. Now that came about as a result of legislative changes, also free trade, and also globalization. There were benefits to that. We were able to get products from other countries that were cheaper, and it was awesome, and we kind of got lost in all of that. But our workers began to see their wages stagnate. It wasn't working for them. And so while all this other stuff was going on, we were suddenly starting to see the middle class begin to slip. And now here we are. I mean, we had to go through recessions. The food banks were born in the recessions, a recession of 1980s. That was important. But then another recession came along a decade later, and then a decade after that. And then there was the Great Recession that happened 2007, 2008. I was in Ottawa while all that was going on, and boy, it was a diabolical thing to try to figure out how to keep a country going when so much money had been wasted and absconded with, and especially south of the border. And it affected all of the global economy. It was really difficult. But we got through that, and then came COVID. And COVID had even a more of a detrimental effect because it kept us apart. We weren't meeting in pubs anymore. We weren't going to schools anymore. People were avoiding one another on buses or on the streets. We just didn't know how to be or how we should be. And now that that has ended, what we've discovered is we're not in any better situation. In fact, it might be worse. Food has gone up 22% since the start of the pandemic. And although inflation has just begun to eke down a little bit, food prices, although they're dipping marginally, they're still going up each year. People are still having trouble affording it. That's true for rent. That's true for so many other costs. And the cost of living itself continues to remain a real problem for people. So we're in a country now that feels stuck in so many different ways. But we used to feel different. We felt different about ourselves. And I think that's really important. I think places like America, Europe, Britain, and others, they all knew that there were things we were going to have to work on. We were going to have to be more inclusive. We were going to have to give people more opportunities. But we did see that we had broke out from history and created middle classes that were not only able to produce and to spend, but to govern themselves, to vote in governments that were a bit to the left of center or a bit to the right of center, but always balancing itself out. But that only lasted for a few decades. And now we're in this position we're in now, and we suddenly don't feel so special anymore, and we're not. And I think that's really important. The Ipsos research firm and polling firm did a study of 28 countries that it's just completed. And it shows how we and the Americans feel compared to how the rest of the world is. And we really felt for a time that we were different than the rest of the world. But listen to some of this stuff. It's really important. 69% say that our country is in decline. But 68% of the other countries say the same thing, a 1 percentage point difference. 60% of Canadians say that the system is broken. 61% of the other countries say the same thing, 1 percentage point again. 69% say that political and economic elites no longer care about working people. 69% in Canada. It's 62% worldwide. And then also in Canada and America, 63% of the citizens say that they don't believe that the experts know what they are talking about. It's 62% worldwide, 1 percentage point. So we might look and think that we're really different, but I think we know we're not anymore. We're like so many other groups. We're actually vulnerable. We're more typical of what everybody else is in. We've kind of lost our way and we don't know quite what we're doing, and we're having trouble. And now we look at it, and Canada's on the ropes. Other countries are on the ropes, doing what we can, but it just doesn't look good. But the recession didn't create that. Those vulnerabilities were already there prior to the recession. And that's very important. We're going through kind of a moral, a spiritual, a social, a cultural kind of recession. There's a hole in our hearts and in our minds that we can't seem to be able to fill. We don't know quite what to do. We're having trouble getting good jobs, affordable housing, having trouble affording food. There's just so many different things. And we don't feel as bullish as we once did. And so what do we turn to? We do what everybody else has done. We've turned to politics to fix it. And therein is our mistake. This is happening in all these other countries that we're talking about as well. Politics now, in a situation like this where problems are so ingrained, people begin to look to politics to provide the solution. And that's never been where the solution lay. The solution always laid within the citizens of a country, progressing, advancing, understanding, expanding. Those things are all really important. But now it's all we're throwing everything on politics. Politics is everything. You can't read the news now without politics being everything, infecting everything that we do. But it doesn't work. And we should be able to see that. And because our situation is not changing, we're looking for more extreme options. This isn't just true south of the border, it's true here in Canada as well. As the right wing and the radical left wing make their pitch to try to get our attention, say, hey, we can change it, vote for us. That has never been the way of the past, and it's not going to take us anywhere in the future, because politics is not where the answer lay. This is really important for all of us to understand. I know I've been there, I've seen how it works. In politics, you go into, say you're a young MP like I was, new MP, and you go there and you suddenly realize that when you go into that place, there are all these different parties and they all have different ideologies and they all have different policies. And all of those things are created to help them win an election. Sometimes they say things they don't even mean, but other times they don't say things that they do mean. I can't tell you the amount of time I've sat down and met with members from other parties in Ottawa who totally agreed with what we were saying about poverty or about South Sudan or about the United Nations or whatever it is, but because their parties didn't agree with it, they could not be seen publicly to do that. This is how politics is now really struggling. And now we've got a left and a right that have pushed out to the edges and are really competing with one another. And if we choose to go there, we will lose the middle class. So it's up to us. It's up to us to fix it. And that's really important. In my view, at the food bank for all of these years has been, it's there that I see democracy really working. It's at the food bank where I've seen all of these people, 3,000 people in our database, all different political stripes, all different cultures, all different religions, all different economic strata that people are from. It doesn't matter. And when they come together, they don't tear themselves apart. They somehow park that stuff at the door and they come in because they have a cause. They're trying to help fellow citizens in this country do better and help them get over this tough time, even as they themselves, as volunteers, are paying more for rent, paying more for food, having more trouble with the standard of living, or watching their kids having to come back home because they can't afford to live out there anymore and maybe can't even get a job that pays enough. This is what's going on, and yet Londoners are so generous that they've committed to the food bank over and over and over again. This is the real lesson, I believe, of the pandemic. The pandemic was about Londoners trying to find something that was bigger than themselves. And the pandemic was definitely doing that, but it was filling them with dread and fear and insecurity and isolation. Loneliness, depression, suicide, all of those things were up. And they're still up. So the people are looking for something. Now, some will go to political parties and say, well, look at this person or what this person said or whatever. But the extreme ones, although it sounds so great because they're going to change the system, they never do. And we're going to be in trouble if we go down that route. What we really need is to come together. That's really important. There was a rabbi in Britain. He was Britain's main rabbi, and his name was Rabbi Jonathan Sacks. He died just a short time ago, but he gave a lecture once that I watched in which he said, you know, the real problem that we're facing now in our world is that we have this thing about, people all being individual and having contracts with one another, kind of like businesses or whatever. Our world is now full of that. So it's individuals all going out there and doing the things that they want to do. Unfortunately, sometimes that has a negative effect on us. For instance, we really want to see local stuff and say that needs to happen and the stuff needs to be cheaper. And there might be a bookstore or a market just down the street, but instead we get on the internet and order from Amazon or somebody else. So sometimes we're our own worst enemies. But what the rabbi was saying was there's contracts and then there's a covenant. Now, of course, he's speaking like a religious man, which he was, but he pointed out that while a contract is about everybody trying to get something out of everybody else, a covenant is about identity. It's about you and me coming together to form us. It's different. It's also more permanent. It also involves values and faith and other things that are really, really essential, including sacrifice and, caring for other people. He's really right. This is what we have lost somewhere along the way in the last 20, 30 years. We've lost touch with one another. Oh, we might go to the odd event at Victoria Park in the summer or Harris Park in the summer, and it's nice to see people back there again, but we've all lost our way with one another. And we don't know quite how to come together in the way that we did before. So here's where we are stuck. We need this identity again. We need to believe in something that's bigger than ourselves. Politics tries to fill that hole in our imaginations and in our hearts by saying, follow me, vote for me, I'll show you the way to do it. But it's always by tearing down something else. Identity, covenant, is about how we fashioned our identity as Canadians through a social structure, not just an independent structure or a liberal or conservative structure, or through an economic structure. We pulled ourselves together to expand as a people, to get on with the things, the kind of life that we wanted to live. That's really important. But we're having trouble seeing it anymore. But not at the food bank. And not at other organizations either. You come down to the food bank and you see democracy in action. Are these people political? Absolutely. Do they have opinions? Every single one of them, including me. Do they have faith? Many do, many don't. Are they from different cultures? Absolutely. Are they trying to outdo one another? Absolutely not. It doesn't happen. Somehow these people have looked at democracy and stripped it of politics. They've been able to bring everybody together at the food bank, and for the sake of helping others, they have sacrificed their time, their money. It's been a remarkable thing to see. It's democracy on the move, democracy in emotion. And that's where we used to be before. We were expanding, we were growing, we were, bringing more people into the blessings and things like that we had here. Now it seems like we're all shrinking and we don't know how to do it. But the pandemic showed us that if we wanted to, a huge thing like that, a huge event like that could happen, like a war or like a huge natural disaster, that for some reason gets people to cooperate together. And that reason is because in every one of us, we are spiritual, moral, ethical beings, and we do need something that's bigger than ourselves. And when we look at politics, we don't see that. We see something that's beneath us. The whole better angels of our nature kind of thing that Abraham Lincoln talked about in his Gettysburg Address. I've memorized that speech. I love that speech. I mean, it was really something. But are we living by the better angels of our nature right now? No, we're not. Are we living by the better angels of our collective nature? No, we are not. So it's time. I think that what the pandemic did is it brought all of these people who could not help in the way that they wanted to. It was a real difficult time. It seemed like darkness was creeping into our society. And what did they do? They got on the phone and they phoned the food bank and other groups as well and said, we want in. We want to help. What can we do? And a pandemic that was supposed to split us all apart brought us twice the amount of volunteers we had had before. This is saying something more about than the food bank or even just the London community. It's saying something about humanity. That without the bigger purposes, without those things that we require, then we will not be able to hang together. We won't be able to survive because we'll all be living as independent planets in our own orbits doing our own thing. The pandemic reminded us that as leaders and others had trouble getting everything together, we as a community could come. We could support one another. We could help one another. I'd remind you that much of the homeless stuff that has happened just in this last while had its roots in the pandemic. Food going out to all of these neighborhoods had its roots in the pandemic. Greenhouses, farm in a box about all of these different containers. People who are having mental health problems or people having addiction problems. Some of the roots of helping all of those different things came out during the pandemic. Folks, it's what we need. The food bank, it's easy to come down to look at somebody else who's not like you, but say, okay, you get that and put it in the hamper, and I'll go get this stuff and we'll put it in the hamper and we'll help somebody. That stuff is fantastic, but it's actually fairly easy. It can be done. But how can we bring ourselves together in such a way that we look at our politicians and our leaders and say, stop it. That's beneath us. We need to build. We need to be productive again and build an economy again. We need to get out there and work and do the things and that hard work ethic that we need to have. But at the same time, we have to be conscious that there are vulnerable people in our community that are no longer being included, whether they're on ODSP, Ontario Works, Indigenous people, refugees coming in, and others. They're on the fringes of society. We weren't content with that before, and we should be content with that now. It's time to build. It's time to bring everybody together. And this series is about how even during a pandemic, people not only built those things, but they built them to last. And that's what we must do now. That's what this series is all about. Go ahead and look at the pandemic as dark days. Go ahead and look at World War II as dark days. But from those things can come tremendous things that can revolutionize and transform us. And that's also the difference between a contract and a covenant. A contract looks out for my interest. A covenant transforms me by bringing me into this larger thing with other people in order to change our world. Look at the best way to save our kids' future is to build it, is to shape it. That's our job. That's our job as people who are involved in our societies. And the pandemic taught us that we can do that in the darkest of times. And I hope this series has helped us to realize that the way that we're going to do that is by coming together, not by following somebody else, but by finding one another and get into the idea of building together again for the sake of our country, for the sake of our city, and for the sake of our children. Let's give them a future by showing them we know how to cooperate.